I come from a family of Christian Ethiopian immigrants. My father fought and escaped communism shortly after the fall of the Ethiopian Empire. I was born in Canada, but I lived most of my life in the Midwest, Americas, Ohio, Michigan, and Indiana. There, I was blessed enough to obtain a private schooling education. As you can see, for all intents and purposes, I'm fully integrated into the greater Western culture. And so are my parents. The point I'm trying to make is that when an immigrant goes into a new country, ideally, that immigrant sheds the backwardness of their past to build a new life in a country that was gracious enough to accept them. Immigrants do not have the right to another country. It's a privilege. This privilege is not something that you should take for granted. It's my belief that if you're an immigrant, especially an immigrant from the third world, you should be bloody grateful that you don't live in the same backwards-ass country your descendants or you came from. In my assessment, based off of the empirical evidence, most ethnic groups are pretty gosh darn grateful. Say what you want about the West Indians in the UK, for example, or the Japanese in America, but hardly anyone can honestly look at these groups of people and confidently say that their actions as a whole are deplorable. That brings me to Muslim immigrants, particularly the immigrants who immigrate into Europe. Many of their actions, generally speaking, make all immigrants look bad. For some horrid reason, too many Muslims are unable to integrate into the greater Western society. Too many hold on to pernicious beliefs rooted in the Islamic tradition. Instead of shedding away the past like most normal immigrants do, or at least tries to do, these Muslim immigrants who immigrate into the UK want to change the UK into Pakistan, and the Turkish immigrants who immigrate into Germany want to change Germany into Turkey. You don't believe me? Then explain to me why a Pakistani immigrant drafted in an anti-Islamophobia motion in Canada that could easily lead to the censorship of legitimate criticism of Islam. But you don't need to speculate to know how bad the problem is with Muslim immigrants. Look at the statistics. For example, 20% of British Muslims sympathize with the 7/7 bombers. 1 in 4 British Muslims say that the 7/7 bombers were justified. 31% of younger British Muslims say that the 7/7 bombers were justified compared to 14% of those over 45. 16% of young Muslims in Belgium state terrorism as acceptable. 12% of young Muslims in Britain believe that suicide attacks against civilians in Britain can be justified. 1 in 4 support suicide attacks against British troops. 27% of British Muslims do not support the deportation of Islamic extremists preaching violence and hate in Britain. 16% of British Muslims believe suicide attacks against Israelis are justified. 37% believe Jews in Britain are a legitimate threat. 16% of all French Muslims support ISIS, including 27% of those aged 18 to 24. And on these figures go. These are all terribly high numbers. And no other immigrant group except them thinks this way. But of course, there are progressive Muslims who are fighting against this. And my hat goes off to them. Women like Ayaan Hirsi Ali, for example, are beacons of light within a dismal Islamic belief system.
Give me your argument against, that is your critique of Islam.
Islam means submission to the will of Allah. A doctrine that requires from the individual to become a slave, in my view, is bad.
But of course, many Muslims object to her view and hold on to their backwards beliefs on Islam. These beliefs, once fully accepted, lead to action. And we've seen it time and time again on the European continent. We've seen well over 1,000 children sex trafficked in Rotherham, UK. We've seen over 1,000 women raped and sexually assaulted in a single night in Cologne, Germany. We've seen terrorist attacks in Nice, France, St. Petersburg, Russia, and more recently in Sweden. Sweden in particular has seen the number of rapes dramatically increase since they've introduced mass unrestrained immigration to solve their demographics crisis. Swedish women today, these days, are too afraid to go out at night, and justifiably so, because if they go out, their chances of being raped have dramatically increased, tripled in some cases. Personally, I'm for very limited immigration. But if you're going to be stupid enough to have an open borders policy, and I'm looking at you, Sweden, at least put in the effort to vet these people. These immigrants have totally backwards ideas on women's rights and human rights in general. These immigrants have backwards ideas on how they should behave in general. And because of that, they're making all immigrants look bad. I'm not an immigrant to Canada, I'm native-born Canadian. But because I look like these people, I have to be profiled and tagged along with them. Fuck that. Stop making us look bad. I'm Jay Feza from the Webble.media. If you enjoyed that video, like, subscribe.